All right, time to deal with the good old horror type of campaign. So basically, I'm basing this off of like the my latest video, Call of Cthulhu campaign that my group and I just recently finished. We just recently finished up our Cyberpunk one, which I'll be getting to this next video. But we finished up our Call of Cthulhu campaign like before we did our Cyberpunk one. So the big question is, how could you possibly bring in like a horror themed campaign into D&D? So now I have gone over the Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So this is the perfect source book to be able to do that because it gives you a bunch of different ideas on how to do several different types of like horror based campaigns and everything. So they give you a bunch of like different like races and characters and classes and like how you would be able to in a sense create characters in a sense the Darklands or like the in a sense the Outlands or like however you want to call it the lands of mist and everything, where like a Barovia and the Curse of Strahd. Now this is kind of a supplemental book to that and everything. So Curse of Strahd is probably like a good example of like at least an adventure in a horror themed campaign and everything. So I as a player, I went through this probably about like 5.5 years ago, through a group that I was in, and so that's like a good example of like oh hey, here's a good template on how to do it. Now this Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft actually expands on that and gives you several different types of like ideas for different campaigns and everything. So like what it does, it starts off and it describes like the different ones. Like it starts off with like a body horror. Like most of us can think of like sitting here, I'm talking, we take that for granted. Like and you're listening, you take for that for granted. We take for granted sitting here breathing, our heart beating, our liver, our organs, everything working normally, and like the whole idea of like body horror is like that kind of like a failing anatomy and everything. So like some of like the concepts of like that would be like you get maybe like a disease like in modern day context would be like cancer that pretty much like ravages your body, and so like it's stuff like that like kind of like get gets into like the horror of like your, like I said, body feeling. So like it gives you a bunch of like monsters, like some of the examples like monsters that you could pull into like this body horror type of campaign would be like the Carrion Stalker, the Gibbering Mouther, Flesh Golem, and the Aboleth Demon. So then it gives like ideas for villains. Like one of the ideas that I came across, like an ancient king who's obsessed with creating a new body to continue his reign forever. So like maybe a king who's on his like near his deathbed and everything, and he's looking to, in a sense, create a new body, like get into that failing anatomy, so he can continue his reign. So maybe he's been king for the last 40 years. He wants to continue his reign, so he's looking for like whether it's a spell or a new body or like whatever. So you can kind of introduce that horror. So like so and some of the other things to get into, like against like the torments, like okay, what's tormenting like maybe the that main villain or whatever. They you come across these monsters that I mentioned that like are kind of his underlings, and so he's trying to like maybe antagonize the PCs into action to kind of like do his bidding type of deal. So like sentence, for instance, like it has the stereotype. All these have like the stereotypical like tables, like D8 or D10 tables where you sit there and you can roll the corresponding dice to come up like with the generic like a random type of things, or you can sit there like what I do like is kind of pick and choose. So like as like I open this book to like kind of showcase like the tables I'm talking about, like the typical uh, tables that like the D8 tables or whatever that you roll on to get like ideas, random ideas, or you can sit there and pick and choose. So like sites you can start off like maybe you start off like with this one like you're in the setting is like a forest, black pines, like a like they're drenched in draped in bodies and everything. So like that could be like the king's like a kingdom and everything, and so with him dying, his kingdom's dying around him and everything. So you could start off, and then they talk about like they have like several different options for like sites and everything that you can start off in this set. And so like you go like the setting, then you get down to the sites and the site itself where you start and everything. So for instance, you could start like at an inn in the valley that has like a inside it's dark and shrouded in like and it's drowned in like as I'm trying to read my notes and everything. Uh, just kind of like the pretty much decrepit inn, and then like the whole plot is like maybe like the dying king like is thinking like, oh, maybe if I cast out these fiends that have infiltrated the community by wearing corpses of recently dead, maybe like these fiends are what's holding me back from like my court wizard from being able to cast the spells and stuff that like will let me like get a new body. And then of course you could do a whole like a side flip and like turns out that the whole king himself is actually like a demon in disguise or whatever. So like it gives you tables like that to kind of like generate ideas on like how you'd run, like in this instance like a body horror. So like the next one they go over would be like a cosmic horror. Think of like the vastness of space and everything. So like for those of us like myself that live in rural areas, when you go outside and we look up at the sky, we see the whole like Milky Way and everything, and like we kind of like can feel very insignificant. And like for instance, like what you could do with this cosmic horror is run something like a Spelljammer type of campaign. So because some of the monsters that they mentioned are like the Githyanki, Grell, Mind Flayer, Beholder. So like races that you would typically find in like a Spelljammer type of campaign or whatever. So like again, so like maybe like a villain that you could use is like one of the things that I like saw was like a priest. He's obsessed with like building a shelter that will protect him from the coming apocalypse. And like for instance, like one of the torments. Maybe he's like the Dark Lord. So like the idea of going off this tangent with Dark Lords is that the Dark Lords in each type of like a land, like a Strahd is the Dark Lord of Barovia. So this priest is like in a sense probably the Dark Lord of this dark land, or like this horror campaign. So he sees like multiple dimensions and is going blind from their incandescence, and so that's maybe why he's like going mad and he wants to build that shelter from his for the coming apocalypse or whatever. So sentence and like maybe you crash land on a world like a world that's has slowly vanishing land masses that are be overtaken by an obsidian sea is one of the examples they give in this one. The site that like I kind of like picked to kind of use as an example for this one is like you're in the ninth basement of a home of a family home that looks normal from the outside and everything. So like a ninth basement, you could kind of correlate into like the ninth gate of hell or something. Just as kind of the thought to get people thinking on like, oh, how do I turn this into much broader things and everything. So like and like one of the plots is that you could use is like this the villain, like I said with the priest and everything, he like thinks that like the a noble's grandchild is going to in a sense kick off the apocalypse, and so he has like a sect and everything that's like trying to kill this noble or kidnap him and like maybe sacrifice him so he can stop the apocalypse and everything. So it gives like tables like for instance like talks about the type of thing like like for this one like the cosmic horror gives you a list of the monsters, gives you a table for like the ideas for villains, the torments, the settings, the sites, the plots. So it gives you, like I said, like a D8 table that you can sit there and you can roll a dice on to randomize it, or you can pick and choose. Now, it follows that concept throughout like the rest of them. So, like for instance, like you got like a dark fantasy. Think of something like a supernatural, like supernatural entities and everything. And same kind of concept that goes, excuse me, goes through like all those like tables that I just mentioned: monsters, villains, torments, settings, sites, whatever. Then you can also run like a folk horror type of campaign. So something like that could be like maybe cryptids that came to mind for me, like the good old Jersey Devil, Mothman, the Loch Ness monster, or like maybe Bigfoot. People could be might well be familiar with Skinwalker Ranch. folk, like the folklore for like a site like that or whatever. And then of course the next one would be ghost stories. Maybe like we're talking like around the campfire talking about ghost stories like from spirits from the past, and they are in a sense tormenting. They come back and are tormenting the land like through the ghost stories and everything. Gothic horror is the next one. It kind of gets into like the illusion of self type of deal. Like we lose our sense of self and everything in the type of gothic horror. So you could run into something like that, which could, in a sense, run into like another one that they mentioned, which would be like psychological horror. So like you, in a sense, play those mind games. So if you're a real devious type of DM, psychological horror campaign might be your bag of trick and everything. So they also have like three others. The disaster. So like Illumin disaster. Like I mean, everyone probably remembers the disaster movies like Dennis Quaid's Day After Tomorrow, or like a movie that came out just like probably at this point like 20 years ago or something. That kind of thing. Like and then of course another one of the last ones is occult. You get into like the occult. So like if you can kind of like go into reading occult books and kind of get ideas on how to run something like that. And of course, the last one that they mentioned was like a slasher horror. So like think of movies like Friday the 13th. Jason Voorhees, he's chasing everyone around, killing them one by one. And the kind of offshoot that one of my friends got me into was like the Hatchet movies, which is kind of the same kind of deal. The good old slasher movies where you have this killer who's, like I said, basically going off and like killing people one at a time. So you deal with that like a kind of horror as well. So this is kind of like an overview on how you could introduce like a horror type of campaign into like D&D and everything. So now, is like this book necessarily a must buy to do something like this? I would say no, not really. You could use the DM guide, but I would say you have to do a lot more work. But that's where something like this Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft books comes in handy, because you have like a whole book, like 150 pages or so, dedicated to just this type of campaign and everything. So that way, if you're tired of running like your typical like a high fantasy, campaign, like maybe like you've run through a bunch of the Candlekeep Mysteries adventures, maybe you've done like the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, or like maybe you've gone through like one of the more recent ones with the Vecna Eve of Ruin. That like all this stuff that I mentioned, like I've made videos going over these adventures. So if you're kind of tired of like the same old high fantasy type of like campaign, this would definitely be something worth picking up to kind of like shake things up and kind of like go off on a tangent and like still stay in D&D, but you like what my group and I did. We did go into Call of Cthulhu, so which is the quintessential horror type of like game, not just campaign but game. But if you're like a diehard D&D fan, to introduce the horror concept into like the campaign idea, this book is definitely worth it to kind of like get into the whole idea of like the good old horror themes. And like it does like all the ones I mentioned, gives you like good information on how to do that, how to create characters, how to create like villains and stuff for these types of campaign. So this is the idea of like introducing a horror type theme into your D&D campaigns.